The young lady and her aunt are very affectionate. After she was diagnosed with pregnancy, she felt sorry for her husband. So, I was given to him as a bed warmer. A few months later, the young lady gave birth to a pair of twins, a boy and a girl. The aunt didn't want to disappoint the young lady's sincerity, so she simply returned the favor by executing me. Afterwards, the two remained in love, and their love became a legend in the capital. But when I died, I was 2 months pregnant. When I opened my eyes again, I was back to the time before the young lady gave me to my aunt. In this life, I climbed directly into his father's bed, suddenly become a mother-in-law.
1.
Just like in the previous life. At the beginning of the year, the young lady was diagnosed with pregnancy by the imperial physician. The aunt came back in a hurry, but when he passed by me, his eyes paused on me for a moment. That look was so sticky that it made people uncomfortable. Soon after, the young lady's coquettish voice and the aunt's coaxing voice could be heard from the room. Listening from a distance, there is no greater love than this. After the aunt left, the young lady's personal maid Hongya began to curse. Bah, what kind of girl is this from a good family? Her breasts are so big that they almost push her clothes apart. And with that figure, even the prostitutes in the brothels are not as attractive as her. She is not a good girl. Why did the lady keep a vixen like Chuntao? Inside the house, the young lady sighed, "Don't talk nonsense." Soon, the lady called me into the house. I knelt on the ground with my head down. The lady looked at me for a long while before she smiled and said, "Chuntao, you are a lucky person. I dare not ask for this blessing again." In the previous life, it had only been a few days since the young lady said this. My aunt pulled me into the house and forced me to have sex with her. From then on, every time my aunt came to the young lady's courtyard, she would ask me to warm the bed. I can't really say whether I'm willing or not. The lady raised me by her side since I was little and even asked me to come as a dowry. It is for the purpose that when the young lady becomes pregnant in the future, she will let me prescribe medicine for her aunt. As a maid, I have no right to choose. But just the day before the lady gave birth, the doctor diagnosed that I was 2 months pregnant. My life suddenly became more hopeful. I thought that I would spend the rest of my life serving my aunt and my young lady well. Raising this child to adulthood, it feels like my life was not in vain. When my aunt came to me, I was so excited that I was ready to tell him the good news. Before he could utter a word, he was pushed into the water by the boy next to his aunt. During the struggle, I saw the murderous intent and cold expression in my aunt's eyes. He sighed and said, "Madam is sincere to me. I cannot let you stay and make her sad. Drowning is too painful. I really don't want to experience this a second time in this life."
2.
After the young lady became pregnant, her aunt came to see her every day. But every time he came over, his eyes would linger on me. Sometimes it falls on my face. Sometimes it lands on my chest. Sometimes it falls on my waist. That look made my heart tremble. It was obvious that he was very pleased with my appearance and figure. Every time this happened, Hongya, the maid beside the young lady, would glare at me viciously. After the aunt left, he spat again, calling her a foxy woman. Although the lady smiled intelligently, her eyes were cold. Why was I so foolish in my previous life to think that the young lady was truly wise and wouldn't mind my existence? Hidden in that smile was clearly murderous intent. This cannot go on any longer. In 2 days, my aunt will drag me into the room. But as a maid, my indenture is still with the young lady. It is very difficult to escape the fate of being controlled. At this moment, Xiaoduan's excited voice came from outside. "Madam, the Duke of Xinguo won the battle and will return to the court tomorrow." The lady's face lit up immediately. "Come here, reward." I clenched my fingers, and suddenly an idea came to me. The Duke of Xinguo is my aunt's father. Now I am only 32 years old. He has never married and doesn't even have a wife or concubine in the backyard. Once I become his, no one will make things difficult for me anymore. Even if you are a young lady or an aunt, you cannot go past the Duke. What's more, his aunt is not his biological child. His father was once a subordinate of the Duke. He followed the Duke on the march for many years and unfortunately died. When his wife heard the news, she couldn't survive and died too. At that time, my aunt was just a few years old and had no one to take care of her. The Duke simply took him into his home and adopted him as a son. For all these years, there has been only one young master in the Duke's mansion. 3. The young lady was very happy to hear that the Duke was coming back. She had great respect for her father-in-law. Early the next morning, Hongya was asked to get dressed. Hongya said happily, "Miss, you are pregnant now. The Duke will be very happy when he finds out. When you give him a big fat grandson, he may ask the palace to make you the crown prince. In the future, you will be the crown prince's wife." The lady smiled even more, stroking her belly gently with a look of anticipation. I stood by with my eyes downcast and kept silent. Unfortunately, she will be disappointed. In the previous life, as soon as the Duke came back, he went to the palace for a banquet. The young lady waited until dark, but the Duke still did not come back. But this is convenient for me. The lady didn't like my face and sent me away soon after. I simply went back to my residence and took out all the money I had saved over the years. Go quietly and do it secretly. Finally, I found out which route the Duke would take when he returned. 4. After it got dark, I was holding a lamp and standing on the road that the Duke had to take on his way back. The clothes on her body were very thin. The wind blew, and I couldn't help but shiver with cold. My heart started beating fast. The Duke holds a high position, and it is said that many noble ladies in the capital want to marry him, and quite a few want to sleep with him. But this gentleman is not interested in women. As for those who climbed onto the bed, they were also beaten with sticks and sold out of the house by human traffickers. Such things happen more and more frequently, and gradually, the maids in the mansion no longer dared to have such thoughts. The more I thought about it, the more scared I became. I couldn't help but my hands and feet started to go weak. Finally, I made up my mind. No matter what, if I fail today, my aunt will take my body tomorrow, and I will die in the future. It's better to give it a try, even if you let someone sell it to you. Maybe I can find a way to survive outside the mansion. Waited for about half an hour. Finally, a person slowly walked towards us. Look over there by moonlight. The man is about 30 years old. Unlike the handsome and elegant girl, the man looked broad-armed and had a strong body. There is a long scar on his forehead, his eyes are deep, and he looks intimidating without even being angry. Walking towards the side with a sword and an axe. My legs are a little weak. This looks like it could kill me with one punch. This should be the Duke, right? There was no one around him. I made up my mind, gritted my teeth, and walked towards him with the lamp in hand. When I passed by him, I pretended to sprain my ankle, cried out, and bumped into his chest. 5. This is the first time I've ever seduced someone, so I'm a little unexperienced. But most of the maids in the mansion secretly scolded me as a vixen and immoral. Most of the pimps stared at me and kept coming closer to me, trying to take advantage of me. I think most men like me. Thinking back to my previous life, my aunt loved this place of mine the most. When I fell, I deliberately hit the Duke's chest face to face. The Duke was drunk. I bumped into him, but he didn't avoid me. Instead, he frowned and grabbed my waist. My chest hit his chest, his body was hard, and it hurt. His arms were strong and hard as rocks, and they gripped my waist so tightly that it hurt. I couldn't help but let out a low cry, tears welling up in pain. The Duke lowered his eyes, looked at me, and said in a deep voice, "Who are you?" He seemed to have a cold aura and a deep gaze. Upon closer inspection, the scar on his forehead became more obvious. At first glance, he looks like a ferocious and evil god of death. My legs became weaker. I still feel a little regretful, but remembering how it felt to drown in my previous life, I forced myself to calm down. Thinking about the method of seducing men that I had read in a book before, I gritted my teeth. She looked up at him with red eyes, bit her lip, and said coquettishly, "Who are you? Let me go." Then he made up his mind, blushed, and started to struggle in a pretentious manner. The thin clothes I was wearing had already stretched my chest a little, and now after the struggle, My clothes were even more disheveled, revealing a large area of my chest. The Duke lowered his eyes and stared at me. His gaze became increasingly deep, and his hands gripping my waist became tighter and tighter. 6. The Duke looked at me for a while, pulled the corner of his mouth, and sneered. "Little girl, you are so brave. You dare to seduce me?" Hongya is right. I was born to be a vixen. In my previous life, I followed my aunt for a few months. I know best what men like most. No matter how terrifying the Duke is, he is still a man. Before coming here, I had a few cups of peach wine. Maybe it was because of the alcohol that made him bold. Now leaning in the Duke's arms and smelling the strong smell of alcohol on him, I couldn't help but feel a little tipsy. With a red face, I tilted my head back and looked at him with drunken eyes. The fear in my heart also dissipated a little. I pretended to know nothing, but I was as charming as possible. Pretend to be 3 parts drunk, as if you are 7 parts drunk. The Duke finally aroused my interest. However, he did not take me back to his residence, but took me to his resting place. That night, I tried my best. I almost didn't sleep all night. I only hope that he can be somewhat satisfied and enjoy the taste. When I wake up, I will be willing to take me in and save my life. The Duke is stronger than my aunt, and I find it hard to resist him. The next day it was still dark. I endured the discomfort and limped back to the lady. At dawn, Hongya called me to help the young lady get up. When I entered the house, I found that the aunt also stayed at the young lady's place last night. The young lady's face was blushing, the aunt's face was smiling. The two of them were rubbing their ears together, looking very affectionate. Since the young lady became pregnant, the aunt hasn't stayed here for a long time. I clearly noticed that my aunt's gaze towards me was more passionate than before. Last night, it seemed that some kind of agreement had been reached. When I was helping him wash up, he accidentally squeezed my hand with a meaningful smile. I pulled my hand away in panic, turned my head, and saw the young lady holding a handkerchief and staring at me coldly. This scene was exactly the same as in my previous life, and it made me feel a little heavy in my heart. 7. The lady didn't say anything to me. Her face was still full of amiable and wise expression. After her aunt left, she washed and dressed herself up, ready to pay her respects to the Duke. She smiled and asked me to bring the boiling chicken soup. Go with her. Along the way, the burning sensation in my palms made me feel extremely painful. Even though my hands were red, swollen, and blistered from the heat, I still held the bowl tightly. The bowl is a gift, and the chicken soup is excellent. If these things were to fall, even a maid like me would not be able to afford the loss with my life. When the lady saw that I was pale and silent, her smile deepened. She smiled and praised. "Chun Tao, you're a lucky person." Hongya glared at me and spat viciously. "It's just a chicken soup, but it's like asking for your life. People who don't know would think you are the young lady. You're just a lowly maid. It's a good thing that our young lady is kind, otherwise, with your seductive look, you would have been beaten to death long ago." I bowed my head and said nothing. Hongya was still not satisfied after scolding me, so she slapped me in the face. My face was hit sideways, my hands were unstable, and some soup spilled, instantly burning the back of my hand red. My eyes turned red from the pain, and I gritted my teeth to not let go of the bowl of chicken soup. The lady at the side then calmly rebuked, "Hongya, don't be so rude." Then she smiled at me and said, "I spoiled Hongya, so don't get angry with her, Chun Tao." I lowered my eyes and whispered, "It is my blessing that Sister Hongya is willing to teach me." The lady smiled more satisfiedly. "You are a sensible person." Hongya cursed softly. What a jerk. 8. When we arrived at the Duke's courtyard, we saw many guards in the courtyard. As soon as I walked in, I heard Butler Sue beside the Duke asking, "Have you found the person the Duke is looking for?" My heart skipped a beat, and I almost lost my balance while holding the chicken soup. Before the guard could reply, Butler Sue saw us. His eyes fell on me with an intriguing expression, and then he walked in with a smile to greet the lady. "Young madam, are you here to pay your respects to the Duke? Please come in quickly. I have some doubts. In the previous life, The Duke went out early in the morning to do some business. The lady did not see him. Unexpectedly, the Duke did not go out this time. My heart was pounding. Holding the chicken soup, he followed in with his head lowered and his eyes submissive. As soon as I entered the door, I felt an oppressive gaze falling on me. I didn't dare to look up and put down the chicken soup as the lady instructed. Lower your head and step back. Suddenly, a slightly cold voice sounded. Stop. I raised my head in panic and saw that the Duke's eyes were slightly narrowed, staring at me with an intriguing expression. When I woke up in the morning, the old man was still asleep. Last night, I climbed into bed while drunk. He didn't ask me where I was from, and I pretended not to know his true identity. As a drunken maid, I couldn't stay. My first reaction should have been to leave immediately. Now, this is my first time to officially meet the Duke. I immediately froze where I was, with just the right amount of fear on my face. Then she knelt on the ground with a thump and said in a trembling voice, "This servant has seen the Duke." I lowered my head, my face turned pale, my body trembled, and I suddenly looked panic-stricken and extremely scared. The slightly cold gaze above his head gradually softened. The young lady frowned and looked at me, with a hint of displeasure in her eyes. Then she looked at the Duke with a normal expression and asked doubtfully, "Father, is there something wrong?" The Duke stared at me for a long while before he spoke slowly. "It's nothing. I just saw that the girl's hand was injured." He raised his eyes and looked at Butler Sue standing beside him. Butler Sue nodded immediately and said, "I will ask someone to bandage this girl right away." I left with the maid that Butler Sue had called. Behind him, there was a hint of coldness in the young lady's eyes. Hongye, on the other hand, glared at me with hatred on her face.
9.
"Miss, after you have finished greeting me." My hand happened to be bandaged. The Duke didn't mention anything, and I didn't dare ask for fear of exposing myself. He just followed the young lady back to her residence in silence. My heart was pounding all the way. The lady looked at me and went back to the house. Hongye was holding her anger in her heart and slapped me fiercely. He spat fiercely on the ground and cursed angrily. "Do you think a scumbag like you can dream of being the Duke? If it weren't for our young lady, you would have been kicked out of the house long ago. You are simply disgracing our young lady. I should tear your face off." I knelt on the ground, covering my face and gritting my teeth. "Are you planning to accept me, Duke? Did I fail in bed climbing?" I couldn't help but feel sad. Could it be that in this life, I still couldn't escape the fate of being a bedwarmer for my aunt? Hongye punished me to kneel for 2 hours. In the end, it was because the young lady was afraid that I would hurt my knees, and the aunt thought that she was being harsh on the servants and damaging her reputation as a virtuous and kind person that she stopped Hongye. I also asked Hongye to apply medicine on my face and hands. By the evening, although my hand had not healed yet, the redness and swelling on my face had disappeared. Soon my aunt came. Hongye and I served the young lady and aunt with dinner. My aunt's eyes fell on me frequently. The eagerness in his eyes made me feel uncomfortable. The lady smiled and glanced at me casually. Hongye also kept glaring at me fiercely. I felt even more uneasy, with cold sweat on my palms. Finally, the two finished their dinner. The aunt held the young lady's hand lovingly and said softly and lovingly, "With a wife like this, what else can a husband ask for? It is the blessing of my life to marry you." The young lady leaned weakly in her aunt's arms and said coquettishly, "My husband, please don't make fun of me." Looking at the couple's extremely hypocritical love, my heart went cold, and for the first time, I felt unwilling. The young lady regarded me as a thorn in her side and wished she could get rid of me as soon as possible. My aunt had been coveting me for a long time. After using me to satisfy her needs, she felt sorry for her wife and wanted to use my disappearance to cover up the problem and pretend that nothing had happened. Hongye thought that I had seduced the aunt without restraint and hurt the young lady's heart. She hated me so much that she humiliated me and beat and scolded me at will. But who among them ever asked me if I was willing to do all this? In their eyes, I was just an object to be manipulated and traded. They had already decided my life, death and fate without even telling me about it. That's ridiculous.
10.
They were affectionate and loving for about a quarter of an hour. My aunt became a little impatient and kept looking at me with sticky eyes. The anxiety in his eyes made me feel sick. The lady still smiled, but I noticed that the handkerchief in her hand was wrinkled. She smiled gently at her aunt and said softly, "My husband, I am not feeling well now, so I will not let you rest here. I have someone clean up the side room next door for you. My husband has to attend the morning court tomorrow, so go and rest first." The aunt showed a happy expression, holding the young lady's hand and smiling. "Madam is still considerate." The young lady glared at him coquettishly, then looked at me and said, "Chun Tao, take your aunt to rest next door." The aunt stood up and looked at me with fiery eyes. Seeing that he looked exactly the same as in his previous life, I was immediately terrified. Under the aunt's direct gaze and the young lady's cold gaze, I stood stiffly, led my aunt out of the door, and headed towards the side room. Just when I was almost at the door, my aunt suddenly rushed forward and hugged me tightly in her arms. I was so frightened that my face turned pale. I struggled and screamed, "Auntie, what are you doing?" My aunt held me in her arms and stared at me. He said, "My dear Chun Tao, your mistress has promised you to me. You are mine tonight. Let me love you well." 11. As he spoke, his lips moved closer and his warm breath hit my face, making me feel despair. I hurriedly dodged and pushed him hard, my voice choking with sobs. "Aunt, please let me go. I am the young lady's maid. He restrained my struggle and said, "In the future, you should serve your young lady and master well. Master will not treat you unfairly." As he spoke, he picked me up and walked into the house. I was panicking and immediately shouted anxiously, You let me go. I am already the Duke's woman." The side room is not far from the main room, and they are in the same courtyard. Of course, the noisy lady outside could be heard clearly inside the house. The young lady probably didn't expect that the aunt would be so impatient and would touch me before I even entered the house. I was already very unhappy. Plus, my voice got louder as I said this. Just let them hear it clearly. Soon, the young lady led Hongya out. The aunt stopped and her face suddenly darkened. "What did you say?" As soon as his arm loosened, I quickly jumped down, gathered my clothes and walked to the side, looking at him in panic with red eyes and pale face. The aunt's face looked extremely ugly, and she looked at the young lady, who came out with displeasure. The young lady probably didn't expect that I would cause such a scene, and she almost couldn't keep the dignified smile on her face. She didn't like me serving my aunt, but she was even more unhappy with me rejecting her arrangement. My behavior undoubtedly destroyed her perfect image in front of her aunt. The young lady put her expression in order and looked at me with a frown. "What nonsense are you talking about? My father has never been interested in women."
12.
Hongya also jumped out immediately and scolded angrily. "Haven't you received enough of today's lesson? How dare you still covet the Duke?" Seeing the doubt in my aunt's eyes, Hongya told her about how I seduced the Duke of Shun today and was punished again. My aunt looked at me coldly. The lady's hand that was holding the handkerchief slowly loosened. After Hongya said this, in the eyes of the aunt, this matter had nothing to do with the young lady. The young lady is still the gentle and virtuous wife. And I became a lowly maid who had high aspirations but poor skills and dreamed of marrying into a rich family. Even in his eyes, I looked down on him because I was not the Duke's biological son and wanted to climb into the Duke's bed. How could he not be angry? Because he was not the Duke's biological son, the Duke was slow to request the title of Crown Prince. The aunt has been dissatisfied for a long time. He even had resentment towards his father, the Duke. In my previous life, after I died, my aunt had not yet ascended the throne of the Crown Prince. He and his young lady became increasingly resentful of the Duke. She often scolded him in a room, saying that he did not treat his aunt as his own son. He doesn't even have a child, so when he gets old, he will still have to rely on his aunt. Don't even think about getting away with this old fool in the future. They even secretly plotted to kill the Duke. When he died, the huge Duke's mansion would only have one young master, the aunt, even if he was not the Crown Prince. Isn't this Duke's mansion going to be left to my aunt to inherit? 13. Now, after hearing Hongye's words, the prince's anger was directly aroused. His face was gloomy, and he slapped me hard on the face, angrily saying, "You bastard! How can you slander your father?" I was beaten so hard that the corner of my mouth was bleeding and I fell to the ground. He sneered, twisted his body, and turned his head. He ordered, "Come, tie her up and throw her into my room." The boys came up and tried to tie me up. Looking at Hongye's sarcastic expression, the young lady's eyes were cold. I felt even more unwilling. In this life, even if I die, I will no longer be a tool to be manipulated by others. I broke away from the waiter, knelt down in front of the young lady, and kowtowed while crying. "Miss, please, help me beg for mercy from my aunt. You love my aunt so much that you don't want her to find other women and take me to the Duke. Isn't it because you know that my aunt likes me, so you take the opportunity to give me to the Duke? I am the Duke's woman now, and I will not offend you and my aunt anymore. Please let me go." After I finished speaking, my aunt's face became even uglier. He looked at the young lady with a gloomy face and deep disappointment in his eyes. I know that this thorn has successfully pierced into my aunt's heart. The lady's face turned a little pale. She shook her head and was about to speak when Butler Sue, who was beside the Duke, suddenly came. 14. Butler Sue took me over on the orders of the Duke. I looked at the young lady's forced smile and the gloom in the aunt's eyes as she looked at the young lady. My heart relaxed, and I collapsed to the ground. I lowered my head and hid my happy smile. Great. I won the bet. It was worth my busy night last night. The maid who bandaged me was the daughter of Manager Sue. I inadvertently revealed to her that Miss Tonight intended to send me to her aunt as a concubine. Now, the thing that was about to be in his mouth flew away, and he still asked his wife to make such a fuss. This thorn in his heart must have been deeply embedded in his flesh and could never be removed in his lifetime. Before leaving, the lady looked at me deeply, with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Chun Tao, you are really a lucky person." I bowed, lowered my head, and said, "Thank you for your kind words, Mississippi." Hongye spat viciously at the ground, with hatred evident in her eyes. I followed Butler Sue to the Duke's courtyard. The person who bandaged me this time was the maid named Su Xiang, the biological daughter of housekeeper Su. The Duke has to go out for a few days for something. When I went there, he had already left, which gave me a few days of leisure. I heard. After I left that day, my aunt didn't leave. Instead, he dragged Hongye into the house and forced herself on her. Unlike my previous life, Hongye was not a maid, but was promoted to concubine by my aunt. They also moved to another yard. From then on, the aunt stayed in Aunt Hong's yard every night. 15. It was 5 days later when the Duke returned. He didn't see me until the next day after he came back. The Duke lowered his head and looked at me solemnly, and with the long scar on his face, he looked very oppressive. I knelt on the ground and lowered my head obediently. I was drunk and defiled the Duke. "Please punish me." The Duke looked at me for a long while before speaking. "Look up." I bit my lip hard and looked up with red eyes. The Duke probably thought of my hard work that night, and his eyes dimmed a little. He said in a deep voice, "Well, you can stay in my courtyard from now on." Just like that, I became the only woman in the Duke's mansion. He might be interested in my work and my physical appearance, but in his eyes, I was not that important. So, I am still a maid. The one serving me was Su Xiang. The Duke didn't spend much time in the mansion. It takes about 5 days to come back in 10 days. Every time I come back, I will prepare soup and snacks for him. There was nothing to do in the mansion, so in order to please the Duke, my cooking skills improved day by day. That day, the Duke returned home, and I went to the study to bring him some soup. The Duke looked at the bowl of turtle soup in my hand with an intriguing look. He glanced at me and drank the soup in one gulp. Then he asked me, "Are you bored in the mansion?" I shook my head, pretending that he was the only one in my heart, and said with sparkling eyes, "Every day, apart from learning how to cook, I just count the days and wait for you to come back. It's not boring at all." Of course, in addition to these, I also read many books. What is written and drawn inside are all ways to please men. The Duke raised his eyebrows and held my hand with his big hand. His hands were full of coils, which rubbed my hands a little painfully. I lowered my eyes, looking embarrassed. Oh, you are indeed good at cooking. I raised my head in joy. I have heard that you are a great hero who is decisive in killing. I have admired you for many years. Now I can serve you in person and make soup for you. This is the blessing I have earned in several lifetimes. He narrowed his eyes, didn't say anything, just picked me up and walked into the inner room. Listening to his strong heartbeat, I gently closed my eyes, leaning on his broad and strong arms. That night, the Duke was particularly rude. The next day, I rested on the couch for a whole day. 16. The Duke devoted himself to marching and fighting and serving the country. He is not fond of love between men and women and is not obsessed with having children. Otherwise, he wouldn't have had no wives or concubines in the backyard for so many years. Although he has tasted the joy of it and comes back to me for entertainment, he is not addicted to it. There were some who were eager to try it out. Seeing that I had successfully climbed into bed, they wanted to follow suit. But they were all sent away. 2 months passed in the blink of an eye, and I was still the only maid who warmed the bed in the Duke's backyard. I'm living a dull life here. The young lady and the aunt were having a great time. The false image of love was torn apart. The image of the young lady as a virtuous lady in her aunt's mind has long since disappeared. He no longer felt guilty towards the young lady. He gradually went to her room less and less, and instead went to Aunt Hong's place more often. Aunt Hong found out she was pregnant earlier than I did in my previous life. After she knew she was pregnant, she couldn't wait to tell the young lady the news. She was a loyal person, and even though she followed the aunt, she still treated the young lady as her master. However, the lady drank a bowl of Luozi soup, and she was half dead. That day, she was sold out by the lady. Even if she was a concubine, she was nothing more than a servant, and the mistress could sell her at will. I heard that Hongya cried and struggled and begged for a long time that day. When he was taken away by the human gang, his body was still stained with blood. When the aunt came back, she was furious. He had a big quarrel with the young lady, who had a miscarriage and almost lost the baby. Later, the aunt took concubines one after another. I rarely go to her room anymore. The two were a loving couple in their previous life, but in this life, one of them was secretly favoring his concubine over his wife. 17. 2 months later, I was diagnosed with pregnancy. Although the Duke said he didn't care about offspring, after hearing the news, he still promoted me to be his concubine. He also gave me a lot of gifts. When the news got out, the first ones to get restless were the young lady and the aunt. After I give birth to this baby, my aunt will no longer be the only child in the Duke's mansion. Just think about it, if I give birth to a young lady, it would be fine. If it is a young master, even if he is a bastard, he is still the Duke's biological child after all. As for the young master who is not my aunt's biological child, his future is even more uncertain. I heard that the aunt went to the young lady's room that night. The two had an argument, and the aunt slapped her hard twice. The young lady had another miscarriage and took medicine for several days before she recovered a little. As soon as she recovered, she came to see me. I asked Su Xiang to invite her in. After not seeing her for a few months, the young lady looked much thinner, and her belly looked particularly big. She still had a hypocritical smile on her face, but her pale complexion could not be concealed even with several layers of powder. "Mrs. Chun, I knew from the beginning that you are a blessed person," she said with a smile. I also smiled and replied, "Thanks to you, madam. If you hadn't taken me to see the Duke, I wouldn't be where I am today." The young lady's face was stiff for a moment, and she probably regretted it so much that she almost broke her teeth. She just smiled and exchanged a few words with me, then asked the maid to bring me some tonic and jewelry. As she spoke, her eyes were always on my belly, looking puzzled and yet vicious. After she left, I asked Su Xiang to throw all these away. When I came to the Duke's house, she gave me a valuable bracelet. The bracelet was made entirely of jasper and had been soaked in water with musk and saffron for 2 full months. Not only can it prevent a woman from getting pregnant, it can also cause a miscarriage if a woman is pregnant. It was originally given to me as a reward when I started serving my aunt. I wore it in my previous life, but it was not until the bracelet accidentally fell that I was able to get pregnant. In this life, it has come in handy. The first thing I did when I came to the Duke's yard was to throw this thing away. I think those jewelry were also soaked in musk. 18. My belly is getting bigger as the months go by. When the baby was 5 months old and about to be born, the aunt took in another concubine. That concubine was brought back from a brothel, and she didn't know any rules or regulations. She took advantage of her favor and deliberately provoked the young lady. As a result, the young lady was hit and gave birth prematurely. The lady screamed in pain in the delivery room for a whole day and night. In the end, she gave birth to a daughter and a boy who died. The young lady couldn't bear the stimulation and fainted immediately. She was also injured and spent most of her time in bed. The aunt became even more displeased with her and seldom went to her room anymore. When I was 6 months pregnant, the imperial physician told the Duke that it looked like a boy. The Duke was very happy, although he is not obsessed with offspring. But I also want to train a good son who can march and fight. Unfortunately, my aunt was traumatized by the death of her biological father when she was young and refused to learn martial arts, and the Duke couldn't force her. When the Duke was free, he would hold my hand and say with a smile, "If it's a boy, don't be too spoiled in the future. I want to lead him to the army and fight." I leaned in his arms, nodded, and looked at him with admiration. If he can become a hero like you in the future, my life in this world will not be in vain. He hugged me and laughed even louder. Gradually, he stopped laughing, sighed, and said to me, "No matter whether you give birth to a boy or a girl, I will not go to the palace to ask for permission for the position of the Duke of Jinghua. This position is too high. Let it end with me. If someone else takes the position, they may not be able to enjoy this blessing." I was stunned for a moment. No wonder he was reluctant to ask for permission from his aunt in his last life. I nodded obediently. "I'll listen to you." He looked at my belly and said gently, "I will do my best to teach him. How far he can go in the future depends on his own luck. For the rest, don't even think about relying on me as your father." I nodded, touched my belly, and whispered, "It is a blessing for him to be your child." 19. I accepted the fact that my child could not become the crown prince. But some people can't accept it. When my aunt heard that I was pregnant with a boy, surprisingly, the Duke was found the next day. I was making a tonic soup for the Duke at that time and brought it to the door of the study. Then I heard a quarrel coming from inside. The Duke refused his aunt's request that he ask for permission to appoint the crown prince. My aunt has been resentful of him for a long time. Now that she heard that he was going to have a son and would reject her, the hatred in her heart became even more uncontrollable. He sneered, "You refused to let me be the heir, didn't you just leave it for your own son? If it wasn't for my father, you would have died long ago. It's fine that you are ungrateful, but now you treat me like this. You're simply a selfish person." There was a sound of slapping. The aunt rushed out angrily, her face red and swollen. Behind him was the Duke with a gloomy face and disappointed eyes. As soon as the aunt went out, he saw me standing in the yard, and the hatred in his eyes became even stronger. "Chun Tao, you traitorous bastard, if you had followed me, there wouldn't have been so many problems. You want your son to be the crown prince? Dream on." As he spoke, his expression turned crazy. He rushed towards me madly, trying to knock me down. I stepped back in panic, looking at the Duke for help. The aunt did not succeed. The Duke was a martial artist, and he quickly held me in his arms and kicked him away. The aunt fell to the ground and was held down by the guards, struggling angrily. With deep hatred in his eyes, he stared at me and the Duke. The Duke's face turned livid, and he looked even more disappointed. He shook his head and ordered, "Take the eldest son away and keep him under strict guard. Do not let him out without my permission." He struggled desperately, but was still taken away by the guards. Looking at his current appearance, I can't help but think of myself in my previous life. He also looked at me calmly, looking at me being held in the water, struggling like a wolf. Unexpectedly, now they are facing each other. 20. A few months later, I gave birth to a boy. The Duke named him Rongzian. I think he doesn't seem to want to have children, as the legend says. He probably likes this child. Rongzian doesn't look as big and strong as the Duke. There wasn't even a trace of the Duke in his eyes. It's like they were carved from the same mold as me. Although he is a boy, he is handsome. I looked at this child absent-mindedly. The child in the previous life must have looked like this, right? Although this child looks like me, his personality is very similar to that of the Duke. I have loved wielding swords and guns since I was a child. When he was 3 years old, the Duke began to teach him personally. I felt really bad for him, but he was so young and never complained about the hardship or tiredness. This made the Duke very satisfied. When Rongzian was 5 years old, after years of illness, the young lady finally passed away, leaving behind only a 6-year-old daughter, Rongyu. I felt sorry for the child, so I brought her to live with me and raised her together with Rongzian. Rongyu also has a miserable life. The young lady's health deteriorated after she gave birth to her. In addition, her aunt had long since left her, and she lived in sorrow every day. Gradually, he took out all his anger on Rongyu. I hate that I gave birth to this daughter, who lost money instead of a son. I hate my children even more for ruining my health. If she wasn't pregnant, her husband would not have refused to enter her room. She would not endure the pain of finding him a maid. If there were no maidservants, then everything would not have turned out like this. She seemed to be possessed by a demon, blaming all her sufferings on the child. Rongyu was beaten, scolded, and humiliated by her biological mother since she was a child, and was bullied by servants. Her father ignored her, and even his concubine did not take her seriously. When the child came, he was a small and skinny creature, even a head shorter than the 5-year-old Rongzian. His eyes were timid, he didn't dare to speak loudly, and he didn't even dare to eat more. After raising her for a few months, she was finally able to call me grandma with a shy smile. 21. My aunt was imprisoned by the Duke for more than 5 years and finally showed some remorse. He cried bitterly in front of the guards and asked to see the Duke. I still remember how he plotted to kill the Duke in his previous life. He is by no means truly repentant. But the Duke still didn't give up on this adopted son. Agreed to meet him. I looked at the Duke in a trance, wondering how important my position was in the Duke's heart over the years. Perhaps a stronger dose is needed. My aunt looks much thinner. His face was pale, he knelt on the ground, hugged the Duke's legs, and cried bitterly. He said he knew he was wrong and asked his father to forgive him. The Duke sighed and finally softened his heart. He released his aunt from house arrest. Then he asked someone to set up a banquet and drank and talked with his aunt. After 3 rounds of drinking, the Duke was already a little tipsy. Suddenly, an assassin rushed in, sword in hand, and rushed straight to the Duke's face. I rushed over in panic, and the sword pierced my abdomen. I fell softly into the Duke's arms. I noticed that his arms were trembling slightly as he held me, and there was a hint of panic in his eyes. I thought to myself in a humorous way, this old guy finally has some feelings for me now, right? My head felt dizzy, and my strength gradually faded away. If I can't make it, that's my fate. I just hope that you will treat Zian well, because I died for him. 22. I am a lucky person. After 3 days of coma, he woke up. When I woke up, the first thing I saw was the untidy bearded Duke standing by my bed. Having not washed for 3 days, he looked like a wild animal on the mountain, and looked even more ferocious. When he saw me wake up, he held my hand tightly. He whispered, "Chun Tao, I will never let you down in this life. Whether it's friendly or not, it all depends on how well I pretend." But with his words, it's worth it that I have been humble for so many years. The assassin has been found out. It was the person that my aunt was looking for. His purpose is to take the Duke's life. Zian is only 5 years old now. Once the Duke dies, he will be the only one who calls the shots in this huge Duke's mansion. By then, Zian and I will be an orphan and a widow, and we will be left to be tortured by him. In the fight between father and son, the Duke finally decided not to do it himself. My aunt was arrested by the government for murdering the Duke, a crime punishable by death, and he will be executed in the autumn. Since this incident, the Duke has been much nicer to me. Maybe he really cared about me. We were like a normal couple. Eat together, live together, and educate children together. But he still didn't straighten me out. 23. I have been an aunt all my life. When Rongzian was 16 years old, the Duke was 48 years old. He fought desperately and finally repelled the enemy. People were also seriously injured. The military doctor said that the injury had affected his lungs and might not be curable. He took his last breath and returned to the capital from the border. When he saw me, the old man was lying on the bed, his face was pale, and he was only breathing his last breath. Chunyang. He called me softly. I responded, knelt beside the bed, and held his hand tightly. His eyes were already cloudy. Chunyang, I have already asked the emperor to take back the title of Duke of Jinghua. My eyes suddenly felt hot, and I choked up as I said, I understand. He sighed. I cannot have a legitimate child in this life. You have loved me for so many years, but I have let you down. In the end, I still have to make you a concubine. You have been affectionate for half your life, and now I have a son. I am also the only concubine of the Duke, which is not in vain. I shook my head and said with red eyes, It is my blessing to be the concubine of the Duke. Extra. At the age of 32, I became a beautiful widow. Finally, I no longer have to live my life cautiously and coax others. The emperor took back the title of Duke of Jinghua because of his meritorious service. But I was still given the title of Old Lady. He also assigned Rongzian an unfavored princess. A young man named Juma can never serve as an official in the court in his lifetime. Most of the skills his father taught him are no longer useful. However, the little princess was good-looking and had a good temper, and Rongzian was very happy. Plus, he wasn't as ambitious as his father. Very satisfied with this marriage. After getting married, he took the little princess out all day long. The two vowed to be a pair of heroes roaming the world. Of course, heroes also need to eat and drink. From time to time, he would write to me asking for money. Rongyu was already married and had children. Seeing that I was bored at home, she often brought her children back to see me. At the age of 32, I have become a grandmother. He is so young, yet he is already very old. The second half of my life was really comfortable. Before I knew it, I had lived to be 80 years old. I've had a cold lately and feel drowsy all the time. Often he would sleep for 2 or 3 days. As soon as I close my eyes, I often dream of the Duke. He always blows his beard and glares at me. Said he had been waiting for me for more than 40 years. She even called me a liar for saying that she loved him. As a result, I haven't looked for him for so many years. I have no way to defend myself, and I feel extremely guilty. I did lie to him. I slept longer this time, and when I opened my eyes, I saw a room full of people. They all looked at me with red eyes. Rongyu was already a middle-aged woman, sitting next to her with her grandson in her arms. Rongzian and the little princess no longer lived a life of wandering around the world. Their son is already 25 years old. The child looks very much like his grandfather, tall and strong, with a broad back and strong arms. He has learned all of his father's skills, even surpassing his father, and is roughly as good as his grandfather was in his day. This child's parents were irresponsible. As soon as he was born, they abandoned him and let him wander around the world. I kind of brought him up. At this moment, the burly boy held my hand, and his eyes were swollen from crying. I smiled and said, You look like your grandfather, but your temperament is different. Your grandfather never cried like this. With red eyes, he held my hand and kept talking, saying that he wanted to be a hero like his grandfather. Now there was war on the border, and the emperor had no one to use. He couldn't waste his skills, so he prepared to go to the border to fight. I nodded and said, Be careful not to overshadow your master. After the war, go and travel the world with your parents. Don't refuse all the rewards. Just accept some. Traveling the world will cost a lot of money." He nodded vigorously. I felt a little sleepy again and closed my eyes in a trance. This time, I might really have to go find that old guy. End of the full text.